July 14th, 1994, a small coastal town in California. The night air was calm, the waves heavy below the cliffs of Seabird Point. For most people, it was just another summer evening. For Evelyn and Thomas Miller, it was their 5th wedding anniversary. They had checked into a local motel, shared dinner, and planned what looked like a quiet getaway. But by midnight, everything had unraveled. At 12:30 a.m., Thomas called authorities. He said his wife had gone for a walk near the cliffs and never returned. Officers arrived quickly. The area was searched with flashlights and dogs. Nothing turned up. No bag, no shoes, no sign of where she had gone. One officer later said, "It felt like she just vanished into the dark." Witnesses began to piece together fragments of the night. A fisherman claimed he saw a woman and a man arguing near the cliff edge around 10 p.m. A motel employee remembered Evelyn looking upset at dinner, while Thomas left the table early. By dawn, the story of a missing young teacher was moving through the town like wildfire. Evelyn Carter Miller was just 28. She taught at an elementary school, loved photography, and had no reason to run away. Her family knew something was wrong. By noon the next day, her parents were already speaking with police, demanding answers. Reporters crowded the seaside roads. Neighbors whispered about what could have happened. Was it an accident? Did she fall? Or was there something darker behind her sudden disappearance? At first, investigators kept their focus wide. They treated Thomas as a possible witness, not a suspect. 2 other names soon entered the file: a tourist who had argued with Evelyn at a bar, and a motel worker with a troubled past. Pressure to solve the case mounted fast, but evidence was thin. The trail went cold before it truly began. Her friends remembered her final words before the trip. "This weekend will decide everything." No one knew how haunting that line would become. Before we move forward, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Evelyn's disappearance was an accident? Or do you think someone close to her knew more than they admitted? Evelyn Carter Miller was born in 1966, the only daughter of a middle-class family in California. At 28, she was known for her energy, her smile, and her love for children. She worked as an elementary school teacher, the kind of person who remembered every student's birthday and stayed late to prepare lessons. Friends described her as bright and approachable. Evelyn had this way of making everyone feel comfortable, one colleague recalled years later. She loved the ocean, often traveling to the coast to take photographs. Her journals, filled with notes and sketches, showed a woman who valued memories and small details. In 1989, Evelyn married Thomas Miller. On the surface, they seemed like a stable couple. They bought a home in Oregon, where Thomas worked as a banker. He was 4 years older, 32 in 1994, and carried himself with a serious, almost guarded demeanor. At the bank, colleagues respected him. He was seen as reliable, steady, and reserved. But at home, Thomas showed a different side. He liked control of the finances, of decisions about the house, of the direction of their future. Evelyn, independent and outspoken, clashed with that. The arguments grew sharper as the years went by. By 1993, the cracks in their marriage were hard to hide. They argued over money, over whether to have children, and over Evelyn's growing desire to live more freely. Close friends noticed the change. One friend later said, "She told me she was thinking about leaving him." She even hinted this anniversary trip would decide everything. That sentence, casual at the time, became haunting in retrospect. The summer of 1994 was supposed to be a turning point. For Thomas, the 5th anniversary was a chance to restore the image of a devoted husband. For Evelyn, it was a test. One last chance to see if the marriage could be saved, or if it was truly over. Thomas suggested a getaway to Seabird Cliff, a coastal landmark in California known for its breathtaking views. The cliffs were dramatic, overlooking. The backdrop of the trip matters because it set the stage for what would follow. The cliffs were beautiful, but they also created a perfect environment for an unexplained disappearance. Evelyn had come seeking answers about her marriage. Thomas had come determined to preserve control. The tension between those goals hung over everything that night. Friends back home waited for a call or a postcard, but none came. Evelyn had told several of them she would share photos of the coast, maybe even write in her journal about whether she and Thomas could repair things, but the journal was never filled. As the night wore on, Evelyn left the motel with Thomas. She never returned. By the early hours of July 15th, only Thomas remained, calling police to report that his wife had vanished during a late walk along the cliffs. Officers arrived to find no blood, no clothes, no obvious signs of a fall or a struggle. The cliffside was silent, the ocean below dark and endless. What stood out in those early hours was how quickly the story spread. A young woman celebrating her 5th wedding anniversary had disappeared without a trace. In a small coastal town, that kind of news traveled instantly. By the following morning, residents were already whispering. Some believed it was a tragic accident. Others wondered if there was more to the story. This chapter of the case, the portrait of Evelyn and Thomas and the background of their marriage, matters because it shows the stakes. Evelyn was not simply a missing person. She was a woman at a crossroads, deciding whether to stay with a husband she no longer fully trusted. Thomas, meanwhile, had every reason to maintain appearances and protect his control. The cliffs became the setting for their final hours together, and the silence of that night left more questions than answers. Who last saw Evelyn alive? What conversations took place before she vanished? And why did the investigation that followed split into 3 separate directions, none of which brought immediate clarity? In the next section, we will step into the final hours before Evelyn disappeared. Witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. A fisherman who swore he saw a couple arguing near the cliff, and a motel employee who noticed the tension at dinner. Those fragments became the foundation of the early investigation, steering suspicion in multiple directions, and leaving Thomas Miller, the one person closest to her, just outside the circle of proof. July 14th, 1994. A summer night on the California coast. The cliffs of Seabird stretched into the dark, the waves crashing far below. By 10 o'clock, the town was winding down, but one fisherman out late near the shoreline noticed something unusual. He saw a man and a woman standing close to the cliff's edge, their voices carried in the wind. He couldn't make out the exact words, but it was clear they were arguing. The woman was smaller, with long hair that moved in the breeze. The man was taller, his tone sharp, his movements quick and pointed. The fisherman later said, "It didn't look like a normal conversation. She kept turning away, he kept pulling her back." Within minutes, the 2 figures moved out of sight. That was the last time anyone outside their marriage saw Evelyn Carter Miller alive. Earlier that evening, another person had noticed something just as telling. At the small seaside motel where the Millers were staying, a staff member worked the dinner shift. Evelyn and Thomas had booked a table to celebrate 5 years of marriage. What should have been a happy anniversary dinner felt tense from the very beginning. Evelyn barely touched her food. She looked down at her plate, weary, almost detached. Thomas sat stiffly, answering her in short sentences. At one point he stood up abruptly, muttered something under his breath, and walked out. Investigators were immediately skeptical. The cliffs were dangerous even in daylight. Few locals would risk walking so close to the edge at night, without light, without company. Why would Evelyn, a young teacher with everything to lose, wander into the dark by herself? Yet, as the search began, no signs of a struggle emerged. There was no blood, no torn clothing, no discarded belongings. The ground was uneven, but no clear footprints stood out. It was as though Evelyn had simply vanished into the night. Thomas became the natural focus of suspicion. He was the husband. He was the last person to see her. But suspicion alone is never enough in court. Without physical evidence, without an eyewitness placing his hands on her, the police had nothing solid to charge him with. His statement remained intact. Evelyn left on her own. She didn't come back. Still, the investigation widened quickly. Within days, 2 other names surfaced. Both men had crossed paths with Evelyn in the hours leading up to her disappearance. The first was Victor Hayes, a 29-year-old tourist staying in town for a short summer break. Witnesses inside a local bar remembered seeing Victor speak to Evelyn the night before the anniversary dinner. It started casually, but soon shifted into something tense. Evelyn seemed uncomfortable. One witness later told police, "She looked like she wanted to leave, but he kept pressing. She pulled away." No report was filed at the time, but once Evelyn disappeared, Victor's name rose to the top of the rumor mill. He was an outsider, an unfamiliar face. Outsiders often become easy targets when fear takes over. The second man was Daniel Ruiz, 24 years old, working nights at the motel where the Millers stayed. Daniel's life was marked by poor luck and a criminal record from his teenage years. Small thefts, a fight that ended in an arrest. Nothing violent, but enough to paint him as suspicious in the eyes of many. He was seen moving between the motel and the cliffs during his shift. He was young, single, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. And when Evelyn went missing, Daniel's name too became tied to Whistler. The investigation fractured. Detectives split their time chasing leads that never lined up. Forensic teams combed the cliffs for days but returned empty-handed. The ocean currents made recovery difficult. Without a body, without physical evidence, the case could not progress beyond speculation. As weeks passed, pressure mounted. The town wanted answers. Newspapers published Evelyn's smiling face beside the word missing. Talk shows debated theories. Was it the husband, the stranger, the worker with a record? Every conversation in the community seemed to end in accusation. Police interrogated Thomas several more times. Each session ended the same. His tone was steady, his story consistent. No cracks, no confession. Victor was questioned too, his holiday ruined, his reputation shattered. Daniel faced investigators under harsh lights, his past thrown back at him. Still, no charges were filed. What remained were shadows. 3 men under suspicion, a woman gone, and no proof strong enough to hold anyone accountable. The disappearance of Evelyn Miller. shifted from a missing persons case into something darker, but without clarity. It was as if the cliff itself had swallowed her whole and left behind only questions. The case file thickened with statements, maps, and reports, yet it produced no clear suspect. Detectives argued among themselves. Some believed Thomas had staged the walk to hide what happened after dinner. Others believed Victor's aggression pointed to a dangerous escalation. A few still leaned toward Daniel, the man whose past made him an easy villain. But in reality, no one knew. By the end of summer, Evelyn's disappearance was already sliding toward a cold case. Police resources shifted elsewhere. Leads dried up. Families carried on with unanswered grief. And in the background, Thomas Miller returned to Oregon, quietly rebuilding his image as the man whose wife had simply vanished. But this chapter of the story was not the end. It was only the first layer. Because months later, the ocean gave back what it had taken. And the discovery would change everything. November 1994. 4 months had passed since Evelyn Miller disappeared from Seabird Cliff. Search efforts had faded. Patrols stopped weeks earlier. For the community, the case had slipped into uncertainty. Still unsolved, but with no new leads. That changed when a group of climbers took a weekend trip along the jagged coastline. As they moved across a narrow ledge, one climber spotted something caught between 2 rocks, far below. At first, it looked like debris washed in by the tide. When they looked closer, the outline of a body became clear. Emergency crews were called, and a rescue team fought waves and slippery stone to reach the site. It took hours to lift the remains. News spread instantly through the small coastal town. A woman's body had been found near the cliffs. For many, there was no doubt who it was. The recovery team confirmed what everyone suspected. The remains belonged to Evelyn Carter Miller. She had been missing for 120 days. Now, her disappearance was no longer a mystery of absence. It was a discovery. And the discovery confirmed the worst fears. Her family was brought in to identify personal belongings. Evelyn's silver watch, still strapped to her wrist, had stopped on the night of July 14th. A thin silver chain she often wore remained around her neck. But one detail drew immediate attention. Her wedding ring was gone. It had not slipped off by accident. The ring was missing entirely. The official identification was made. Evelyn was no longer missing. She was dead. The next step. With this confirmation, police were forced to choose their next move. 3 names were already on record. Thomas Miller, the husband who made the call. Victor Hayes, the out-of-town visitor who had argued with Evelyn in a bar. And Daniel Ruiz, the motel employee with a petty criminal record. All 3 had been questioned, but now the pressure was different. The victim's family insisted from the beginning that Evelyn would never have walked out alone that night. They believed the answer was close. But the case lacked direct physical evidence. No fingerprints, no weapon. Only the body and a timeline that raised more questions than it answered. For Thomas Miller, the suspicion grew heavier. Police noted inconsistencies in his story. He said Evelyn went for a walk alone, but multiple witnesses had seen the couple arguing that evening. A fisherman remembered seeing a small woman and a taller man shouting near the edge of the cliffs at 10 p.m. He could not hear the words but saw the gestures, sharp, forceful movements, a heated argument against the dark sea. The motel staff added to the picture. They remembered the dinner earlier that night. Evelyn sat silently, barely eating. Thomas left the table before her. It didn't look like a couple celebrating an anniversary, one server said later. The atmosphere was heavy. She looked upset. These details placed Evelyn in distress and in conflict with her husband, only hours before her death. Yet none of it was enough to arrest Thomas. There was no blood, no signs of struggle in their motel room, no trace evidence linking him directly to her fall. The husband remained under suspicion, but police could not move forward without stronger proof. That left the other two men. Victor Hayes became a target of rumor after a disagreement with Evelyn at a local bar. Witnesses said she looked annoyed as Victor approached her and tried to start a conversation. The dispute was brief, but word traveled fast in the small town. Soon people were saying Victor might have followed her later. Then there was Daniel Ruiz, the young motel worker. He had been seen around the property that night, working his shift. His record from earlier years, small thefts, a charge for disorderly conduct, made him an easy suspect in the eyes of the community. Though he had no connection to Evelyn, his presence at the motel and his past mistakes made him vulnerable. By late November, the investigation fractured. Detectives split attention among the three men. Each had a motive painted by rumor. Each had opportunity described in vague witness accounts. But the evidence was thin in every direction. The discovery of Evelyn's body, instead of narrowing the case, widened it. Forensic science at the time could not extract more detail from the limited samples. The missing ring became an unsolved piece of the puzzle. Was it taken as a keepsake by the killer? Was it sold or discarded? Or had it been lost during the fall? Police could not answer. As the homicide investigation was announced, the town reacted with shock. For months, some had clung to hope Evelyn was alive, perhaps having left on her own. Now that hope was gone. The church bells rang during a memorial. Friends, co-workers, and hundreds of locals gathered to honor her. Teachers from her elementary school held candles. Former students brought flowers. For the family, it was grief mixed with determination. They called for justice. They demanded answers. The pressure shifted directly onto the investigators. Reporters swarmed the courthouse and the police station. Headlines declared the town unsafe. Families whispered about who among them could be responsible. In a place where people knew each other by name, suspicion cut through friendships and neighborhoods. Thomas Miller appeared at the memorial, standing with Evelyn's parents, keeping the image of a grieving husband. Cameras captured his stoic face, his arms folded. Some took it as strength. Others saw. But while the town leaned toward rumor, the evidence itself refused to point clearly. The forensic report was blunt and conclusive. Evelyn died from head trauma before falling. But beyond that, the file was thin. The homicide investigation was officially active, yet no charges were filed. Detectives promised the family they would continue. The parents of Evelyn left the station with tears, repeating the same words. Find who did this. Don't let her be forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the trail went cold again. The physical remains had been found, the autopsy written, the community shaken. And yet investigators were no closer to naming a killer. But in one sense, the case had changed forever. Evelyn's name was no longer listed under missing person. Her file now carried a different label. Homicide. And in that new classification came a heavy burden. Because now, the expectation was not just to search, but to solve. As the town processed the discovery, two men began to carry an unwanted spotlight. Victor Hayes, the tourist who argued with her. Daniel Ruiz, the employee with a troubled past. Both became the focus of suspicion, both portrayed in the press as likely culprits. Neither had been charged. Neither had been proven guilty. Yet their lives were about to unravel. In the next part of this case, we will see how quickly suspicion turned into stigma, how rumor destroyed reputations, and how two innocent men were dragged into a nightmare simply because investigators could not find the real answer in time. The discovery of Evelyn's body in November 1994 turned the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide. And with that shift came the demand for a suspect. Someone had to be blamed. Someone had to carry the weight of what happened at Seabird Cliff. Within days, two names rose to the surface. Not because of strong evidence, but because of circumstance, gossip, and the pressure to find answers. Victor Hayes and Daniel Ruiz. Neither man had anything to do with Evelyn's death, but both would pay a heavy price for being in the wrong place. The press loved the story. Headlines called him the last man seen arguing with Evelyn. They ran his picture alongside the words, prime suspect. Within a week, Victor's life unraveled. The company he worked for called him in. They said his name in the papers was bad for business. They called it damage to reputation. He lost his job. At home, things got worse. His wife, unable to bear the constant whispers, the calls from reporters, the stares at the grocery store, filed for divorce. Victor became isolated, branded as dangerous, even though the police never charged him with a crime. He was questioned several times, each time insisting he had nothing to do with Evelyn's disappearance. He told investigators he had left the bar alone, gone back to his hotel, and slept through the night. There was no evidence to prove otherwise. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA. But innocence didn't matter to the public. Once a name is printed under the word suspect, it sticks. For years, Victor carried that label. Neighbors whispered. Former friends kept their distance. Every time a new article came out about the case, his name resurfaced. If Victor was the outsider, Daniel Ruiz was the easy target inside the community. He was 24 in 1994, working nights at the motel where Thomas and Evelyn had stayed. Daniel's record wasn't clean. As a teenager, he had been arrested for shoplifting and disorderly conduct. Minor crimes, but enough to sit on a permanent file. Enough to resurface when police asked, "Who around here looks suspicious?" Daniel admitted to being near the motel lobby the night Evelyn vanished. He said he saw her walk back to her room after dinner looking tired. He denied ever speaking to her. But rumors started anyway. The whispers grew. He was young, single, with a record. Maybe he was obsessed. Maybe he followed her down the path to the cliff. A co-worker at the motel told investigators, "People just assumed it was him because of his past. But I never saw him bother anyone." It didn't matter. The press painted him as the troubled motel worker. Articles called him unpredictable. The community turned against him. Management at the motel let him go. One detective admitted years later, they both looked suspicious on paper. But suspicion isn't proof. The community didn't want to hear it. They wanted resolution. And with Thomas Miller, the husband, still presenting himself as a grieving widower, attention stayed on Victor and Daniel. The police issued careful statements. They said both men had been questioned. They said the investigation was ongoing. But in the eyes of the public, silence sounded like guilt. Every headline, every news broadcast, every rumor strengthened the illusion. Victor Hayes, the pushy stranger. Daniel Ruiz, the troubled worker. For the town, it seemed obvious. One of them must have done it. The impact was devastating. For Victor, life collapsed quickly. He spent years moving from job to job, never holding a position long. Employers Googled his name, found the old stories, and quietly dismissed him. His marriage ended. His children grew up distant. Friends avoided him at social gatherings. Even after police shifted focus, the stain remained. Victor later said in a rare interview, "I didn't just lose my job. I lost my life. People never looked at me the same again." Daniel's suffering was quieter but no less brutal. He couldn't find steady work. Every employer hesitated when they realized he was that Daniel Ruiz. His family carried the shame with him. Bills piled up. His father's small business failed partly under the weight of lost customers who didn't want to be connected to the suspect's family. For years, Daniel lived in the shadows. He rented small rooms, worked odd jobs under the table. It took more than a decade before he could open a small mechanic shop, finally finding a way to support himself again. But even then, some customers looked at him with suspicion, whispering when he turned his back. What made it worse was that the real suspect had been right in front of everyone. Thomas Miller, Evelyn's husband, had always been in the picture. Police questioned him the night she disappeared. They knew his marriage was strained. They even considered financial motives. But without a body, and later without clear evidence, the case shifted. It was easier to chase the stranger in the bar. It was easier to target the young man with a criminal record. And while the focus stayed on Victor and Daniel, Thomas rebuilt his life, moving back to Oregon, remarrying, and living free of suspicion. As the years stretched on, the names Hayes and Ruiz remained tied to Evelyn's death. Every time the case was mentioned on anniversaries, their names appeared again. Every article reminded the public of the two prime suspects who had never been cleared. For Victor, the suspicion lasted nearly 2 decades. For Daniel, it lasted even longer. Neither man would truly be free until 2011, when the truth finally came out. By then, the damage was done. 17 years of suspicion leaves scars that can't be erased. Jobs lost. Families broken. Lives wasted under the weight of something they never did. In the end, Victor Hayes rebuilt slowly, working freelance, living quietly, far from the headlines. Daniel Ruiz fought his way back, too, eventually running a small repair shop, trying to put his past behind him. But both men were permanently changed. Their names had been dragged through mud, their dignity shattered, their futures altered. They were victims, too, casualties of a system desperate for answers, of a community too quick to judge, and of a killer who walked free, while others suffered in his place. By 1995, investigators had run out of steam. They had questioned, speculated, and pursued every lead. What do you think about the way Victor and Daniel's lives were destroyed by suspicion? Do you believe the police should be held accountable for chasing the wrong men for so long? Share your thoughts below, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Because in Part 6, we uncover how the case collapsed, why the trail went cold, and how Thomas Miller, Evelyn's own husband, slipped through the cracks for years. In early 1995, after months of searching for answers, the investigation into Evelyn Carter Miller's disappearance and death slowed to a crawl. Detectives had spent long nights chasing leads, running interviews, and reviewing evidence. but nothing pointed to one clear suspect. No blood, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, no confession. By spring, the department announced what many feared. The case would be suspended. Newspapers carried the same headline across California: "No sufficient evidence to charge in Seabird Cliff case." For Evelyn's parents, it was devastating. They had been promised justice. Now, just a year after their daughter vanished, the official word was that nothing more could be done. But not everyone accepted that answer. Some within the department admitted privately that the closure wasn't about a lack of leads. It was about pressure. One investigator later revealed that they had briefly uncovered financial documents linking Thomas Miller to a large life insurance policy in Evelyn's name. It had been signed the year before she died, with Thomas as the sole beneficiary. That detail should have set off alarms. Instead, the team turned away from it. Why? Because the town wanted quick answers. Public anger had been growing since Evelyn's body was found wedged in the rocks. The community wanted a suspect, and they already had two names: Victor Hayes, the visiting tourist, and Daniel Ruiz, the motel worker with a juvenile record. Both had been in the area, both had drawn suspicion, and both seemed easier targets than Evelyn's grieving husband. "We almost had him," the detective admitted 3 years later, in 1998, Thomas remarried. His new wife was a co-worker at the bank, a woman who described him to friends as quiet, hard-working, and responsible. Few in Oregon even knew about Evelyn. For those who did, Thomas told the same story he had told police. She went for a walk by the cliffs and never came back. To everyone else, he was a man who had endured heartbreak and found a second chance. While Thomas was rebuilding his life, Evelyn's family was left to fight alone. Her parents refused to give up. They wrote letters to the district attorney. They called detectives. They pleaded with the press. Year after year, their requests to reopen the case were rejected. Without new evidence, the file remained closed. The silence was crushing. At vigils, Evelyn's friends repeated the same message: Thomas must know more. They believed it with their whole hearts, but belief was not enough. Evidence was required, and evidence was missing. By the late 1990s, the Seabird Cliff case had cooled into a classic cold case. Police stopped visiting witnesses. The media moved on. And the small town where Evelyn had once lived tried to forget. But forgetting didn't come easily for Victor Hayes and Daniel Ruiz. Victor, once a respected technician, still carried the label, "the stranger in the bar." He had lost his job within weeks of being named in the papers. His wife divorced him under the strain. For years, whenever his name came up in conversation, someone would lower their voice and ask, "Wasn't he the one from the Cliff case?" Daniel Ruiz fared no better. His teenage record for petty theft and fights gave the community an excuse to single him out. Rumors spread that he had followed Evelyn that night, that he had been obsessed with her, that he had lured her away from her husband. None of it was true, but rumors were more powerful than facts. Daniel was fired from the motel. His family was harassed. Money dried up, and the stigma followed him for more than a decade. Both men endured endless questioning. Police brought them in multiple times, and so the case stalled. Files collected dust in evidence rooms. The memory of Seabird Cliff faded into local folklore, whispered about in hushed tones, but never solved. In 2001, the Los Angeles Times ran a short anniversary piece, calling Evelyn's disappearance and death one of California's enduring cold cases. By then, most assumed the truth would never come out. Yet behind the quiet, something darker was happening. Thomas had built his new life on the ashes of his old one, but secrets don't stay buried forever. In 2008, trouble returned to his home. His second marriage began to unravel. Divorce proceedings pulled his finances into the light. And for the first time in over a decade, the insurance policy he had once taken out in Evelyn's name resurfaced. But that's where the silence of the 1990s ended, and the storm of the 2000s began. For more than 10 years, Evelyn's case was labeled unsolvable. For more than 10 years, Victor and Daniel bore the weight of suspicion. For more than 10 years, Thomas lived free. That was about to change. By 2008, more than 13 years had passed since Evelyn Carter Miller's disappearance. The case had gone cold, filed away as another unsolved mystery. Thomas Miller had moved on. He was living in Oregon, remarried, working steadily, raising a new family. To outsiders, he looked like a man who had survived tragedy and rebuilt his life. But then, everything began to crack open. It started with his second marriage falling apart. In 2008, his wife filed for divorce, and the court required Thomas to disclose his financial history. What surfaced was shocking. A life insurance policy taken out in 1993, 1 year before Evelyn vanished. The policy was valued at $250,000, and Thomas was listed as the sole beneficiary. On its own, an old insurance policy might not have meant much, but in context, it was explosive. Evelyn had disappeared in July 1994, and the timing of the insurance purchase just months before raised questions no one could ignore anymore. By late 2008, whispers began spreading in the community. People remembered Evelyn's smile, her energy, her life cut short. And they remembered how quickly suspicion had been directed away from Thomas all those years ago. Now the insurance policy and divorce filing painted a darker picture. Newspapers ran headlines, "Was Thomas Miller the forgotten suspect?" and "Did investigators overlook the obvious?" Then, another breakthrough. A former motel employee, now in his 50s, was contacted by reporters covering the story. He recalled something that had always bothered him. On the night Evelyn disappeared around 11 p.m., he saw Thomas return to the motel's front desk. His clothes were dirty, with visible mud stains. Thomas appeared tense, avoided eye contact, and left quickly. The employee had mentioned this detail in 1994, but investigators dismissed it as minor. At the time, they were consumed by the theories around Victor Hayes and Daniel Ruiz. With pressure to deliver a suspect, those two names dominated headlines. The motel employee's account, pointing back to Thomas, had slipped through the cracks. But in 2008, with distance and perspective, his words carried more weight. "I remember it clearly," he told interviewers. "That was the night Evelyn vanished." He came back to the motel looking nervous, with mud on his clothes. "I've never forgotten it." This testimony reignited public outrage. How could such a detail have been ignored for so long? And why had investigators focused so heavily on Victor and Daniel when Thomas had been there, covered in mud, just hours after his wife was last seen alive. For Evelyn's parents, the new attention was both painful and validating. They had always believed Thomas was involved. For more than a decade, they wrote letters to police, prosecutors, even state officials, begging for the case to be reopened. Most of the time, their requests were denied or ignored. Now, the tide was finally turning. By 2009, local newspapers and TV stations were covering the case again. Editorials demanded answers. Commentators asked why the most obvious suspect, the husband. The admission only fueled public anger. How could investigators have overlooked such critical pieces? And more importantly, could they correct their mistake before it was too late? In 2008 and 2009, Evelyn's family worked with advocates to demand the case be reopened. They collected signatures, presented petitions, and spoke at city council meetings. The story even reached state news, where broadcasters questioned how a potential financial motive could have been buried for more than a decade. The mounting attention made one thing clear. This was no longer just a forgotten cold case. It was a public scandal. People wanted answers, and they wanted accountability. For Thomas, the walls were closing in. Once seen as a grieving widower, his carefully built image began to crumble. Neighbors in Oregon read the news and started whispering. Co-workers looked at him differently. Friends asked quiet questions. For the first time since 1994, he was back in the spotlight, and not as a victim, but as the man many now believed was responsible. By late 2009, investigators had little choice. The case was too visible, the public too vocal. The California authorities made an announcement. The Evelyn Carter Miller case would be formally reviewed again. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every overlooked lead would be re-examined. The announcement was met with applause at community gatherings. For Evelyn's family, it was a bittersweet moment. They had waited years, buried under silence and doubt. Now, finally, there was a chance that justice could be revived. The stage was set for the next chapter. With renewed pressure, a damning insurance policy, a forgotten divorce filing, and a resurfaced witness, the puzzle was no longer scattered. The pieces were finally aligning. In the following section, the story moves into 2010, when investigators re-entered the case file. What they uncovered would change everything. A pawn shop receipt, a wedding ring, and a signature would bring the truth into the open, exposing Thomas Miller for who he really was. In 2010, more than 15 years after Evelyn Carter Miller disappeared from the cliffs of California, her name returned to headlines. For years, the case had been cold. The file sat in storage, dust collecting on every page. But pressure from the public, renewed attention from journalists, and the persistence of Evelyn's family forced the police to act. After years of silence, the sheriff's office announced that the case of Evelyn Carter Miller would be reopened. This time, they promised, nothing would be left unchecked. A special unit was assigned. Some of the investigators were veterans who had worked the case in the mid-90s. Others were younger, new to the department, with fresh eyes and fewer biases. Together they gathered in a small conference room lined with boxes of old evidence, newspaper clippings, and witness reports. For days, they spread everything across the tables, rereading old notes and comparing timelines. The question that guided them was simple. What did we miss? The review started with the basics. Evelyn's disappearance in July 1994. The discovery of her body 4 months later. The broken skull. The missing wedding ring. Then the team moved to the names that had dominated headlines. Victor Hayes, the visiting tourist, Daniel Ruiz, the motel worker. Both had lived under suspicion for years, but the files showed no direct evidence. They had been convenient suspects, not convincing ones. A detective muttered while flipping through the papers. So much noise, so little proof. But buried deeper in the folders were documents that had been overshadowed back then. A life insurance policy dated 1993. A petition for divorce that Evelyn had filed just weeks before the trip. A motel employee's statement that Thomas had returned late that night with mud on his clothes. These pieces were there in 1994, but no one had ever put them together. An investigator wrote in his notes, "The details were always here. We just never connected them." The breakthrough came not from a dramatic new lead, but from the quiet work of checking old financial records. Investigators searched pawn shop databases, tracing transactions from Oregon, where Thomas had moved after the case went cold. There it was, a record from the fall of 1994. A pawn ticket for a gold wedding ring. The seller's name, Thomas Miller. The signature, a match to his bank documents. Detectives compared the description with Evelyn's missing ring. The details fit. Size, inscription, and the timeline. Only weeks after Evelyn's disappearance, Thomas had walked into a pawn shop and exchanged his dead wife's ring for cash. This was the first piece of physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. News outlets exploded with the story. One headline read, "The ring that spoke after 17 years." Others called it, "The ring that unmasked a killer." With the ring in hand, the picture grew clearer. The motive had always been financial. Evelyn's life insurance policy, worth $250,000, named Thomas as the sole beneficiary. If the divorce had gone through, he would have lost it all. At the same time, his career at the bank was faltering. Colleagues remembered him complaining about debts and money troubles. And then there was the opportunity. He was the last person with Evelyn that night. Witnesses placed them arguing near the cliff. Hours later, her body was gone. When investigators revisited the motel employee who had once spoken about seeing Thomas late that night, the man was older now, but his memory remained sharp. He told them again. He came back after 11. His shirt had mud on it. He looked nervous. I never forgot that. Back in 1994, this testimony had been filed away, almost ignored, because attention was focused on Victor and Daniel. But now, paired with the ring and the financial records, it carried weight. For the first time, the case against Thomas Miller was not just suspicion. It was evidence. In May 2011, 17 years after Evelyn disappeared, police officers drove quietly to Thomas Miller's home in Oregon. He was living in a modest suburban neighborhood with his second wife. Neighbors later described the scene. A calm morning, then unmarked cars pulling into the driveway. Officers walking up to the front door. Thomas was arrested without incident. The charge, first-degree murder. When the news broke, the reaction was immediate and visceral. People who had once pitied Thomas as a grieving husband were stunned. Some refused to believe it. Others said the truth finally made sense. Evelyn's parents, now older and frail, wept as cameras surrounded them. Her mother said, "For 17 years he lived free while we carried the weight." Today, justice has begun. The arrest didn't just change the story of Thomas Miller. It changed the stories of Victor Hayes and Daniel Ruiz. For years they had been seen as the likely killers. Their names had been whispered with suspicion. Now reporters wrote about them again. This time the headlines were different. Cleared after decades of suspicion. Victor spoke briefly to a local paper. It doesn't erase what happened to me. But at least people will finally know I wasn't the man who hurt her. Daniel, who had struggled for years to rebuild his life, said quietly, "I hope this means people will stop looking at me like I'm guilty." The arrest highlighted the damage done by misdirected suspicion. The public, once so certain, was forced to face its own mistakes. The reopening of the case also brought sharp criticism of the original investigation. Why had the insurance policy been ignored? Why had the pawnshop records not been checked? Why had the motel employee's testimony been sidelined? Commentators asked the hardest question. If the police had done their job in 1994, would Evelyn's family have waited 17 years for justice? A former detective admitted to reporters, "We had enough to look harder at Thomas. But we were blinded by the pressure to find an outsider. That was our failure." The case became not just about Thomas Miller, but also about how systems fail when bias and pressure outweigh evidence. By the end of 2011, the stage was set for a trial that would draw statewide attention. Prosecutors prepared to present the life insurance policy, the divorce filing, the pawnshop records, and the witness testimony. Together, they painted a story of a husband who killed his wife not out of passion, but out of calculation. As Thomas sat in a county jail cell awaiting his day in court, reporters called it one of California's most haunting cold cases finally coming to light. The community that had once whispered theories about Victor and Daniel now prepared to watch the real story unfold in a courtroom. The arrest was only the beginning. The real test would come in 2012, inside the walls of a California courtroom. Would the evidence hold? Would a jury believe that Thomas Miller had carefully planned the death of his wife to protect his money and his future? The trial would decide everything. It would reveal. The prosecution wasted no time. They laid out a sequence of evidence that, when combined, formed a damning picture. First, the life insurance policy. In 1993, just 1 year before Evelyn vanished, Thomas had taken out a $250,000 policy on his wife. He was the sole beneficiary. At the time, no one questioned it. In 2012, it became a central piece of the puzzle. Next, the divorce papers. Evelyn had filed shortly before their trip to the coast. Had the divorce gone through, Thomas would have lost everything. The timing was critical. Then came the testimony of the motel employee. He told the court he saw Thomas return late on the night Evelyn disappeared. His clothes were dirty, marked with mud. Thomas looked tense, hurried, and avoided eye contact. Back in 1994, this statement had been overlooked. Now, it was front and center. Finally, the most devastating piece of all. The pawnshop receipt. Investigators had uncovered that Thomas sold a gold wedding ring in Oregon just weeks after Evelyn's death. The receipt carried his signature. It matched the missing ring Evelyn was known to have worn on the night she vanished. Prosecutors held up the document and called it the ring that told the truth. Piece by piece, the case against Thomas Miller was laid bare. The prosecutor's words were simple but sharp. This was not an accident. This was a murder, planned for money, carried out in silence, and hidden for nearly 2 decades. The defense attempted to dismantle the narrative. They claimed there was no eyewitness who saw Thomas push or strike Evelyn. They argued the ring could have been found after her death, and that Thomas sold it in grief, not guilt. They questioned the reliability of memories that were nearly 20 years old. But their arguments felt thin compared to the weight of the evidence. The jury saw a man with motive, opportunity, and direct financial gain. The pieces fit too well. After days of testimony and closing arguments, the jury deliberated. It took less than 6 hours. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper. The words echoed in the silent courtroom. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Miller, guilty of first-degree murder." The judge delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thomas Miller showed little reaction. For the first time, the mask of the grieving husband had been stripped away. He was no longer a widower. He was a convicted murderer. Evelyn's parents embraced, crying openly. Her father spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. "We have waited almost 2 decades for this day. Now our daughter finally has justice. It doesn't take away the pain, but it gives us peace." Her best friend, the one who had warned police years earlier that Evelyn wanted a divorce, stood with the family and said simply, "She deserved to be heard." And finally she was. For Victor Hayes, the verdict was both a relief and a reminder of what he had lost. He had been branded suspicious, lost his job, and his marriage collapsed under the weight of public doubt. Standing outside the courthouse, he told reporters, "They cleared my name today, but no one can give me back the years of being called a killer." Daniel Ruiz spoke quietly. He explained how the rumors destroyed his reputation in his hometown, how he struggled to find work, how his family suffered because of whispers that never stopped. "I feel free today," he said, "but it took 17 years too long." After the trial, former investigators admitted mistakes. One officer told a local newspaper, "We should have looked closer at Thomas from the beginning. We let public pressure steer us toward outsiders, and it cost us years." The California Police Department issued a statement promising reforms. They pledged stricter reviews of financial records in missing person cases, mandatory follow-ups on family conflicts, and better safeguards against tunnel vision during investigations. The trial had not only brought justice, it also exposed the cracks in the system. The case became a teaching moment for law enforcement nationwide. For Evelyn's family, the verdict gave them the closure they had begged for. They created a scholarship in her name for young teachers, ensuring her memory would help others pursue the career she loved. Each year, students wrote essays about betrayal and fairness, honoring the values Evelyn had stood for. For Victor and Daniel, the trial was the start of redemption. Victor rebuilt his career as a technical consultant and found peace living quietly, away from the spotlight. Daniel opened a small repair shop, finally standing on his own without the weight of whispers. They remained marked by their ordeal, but both spoke publicly about the importance of not rushing to judgment. Even for law enforcement, the case changed the way investigations were handled. It reminded officers, prosecutors, and communities that patience, thoroughness, and balance were not optional. They were essential. Society, too, learned. Newspapers that once printed sensational headlines about the stranger at the bar or the motel clerk with a record later issued public reflections on their role in feeding false suspicion. Communities that once turned against two innocent men later rallied to support them. The case left scars, but it also left lessons. The trial of Thomas Miller closed the book on one of California's most haunting mysteries. Evelyn Carter Miller did not return, but her voice was finally heard. Her death revealed a killer hiding in plain sight, exposed the cost of investigative failure, and gave justice not only to her family, but also to the men who carried the burden of false suspicion. The story ends with a truth simple yet powerful. Justice may take years, even decades, but it can still arrive. The final line of the case remains etched in the minds of all who followed it. The truth does not need technology. It only needs patience. And the killer can never hide forever.